start the recording now. And then Martin, we will hand over to you. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you. I'm speaking to you from Helmsley in North Yorkshire, a small market town on the edge of the North York Moors where I live. I can say that the sun is shining for the first day for several days. It stopped raining yesterday and it's looking a lot brighter, and I hope it's looking brighter where you are, because I realize I gather I'm talking largely to a Manchester, Stockport, Northwestern audience. Some of you may be in London perhaps, but your largely Northwestern audience, I do realize that you've had some terrible weather. You may have been threatened by floods, and we're speaking against a background of pretty awful news day to day. Full hospitals, no clarity on reopening of large sectors of the economy and so on. But I chose as a slogan to put on my introductory slide, you may call it a cliche, but anyway, it's a valuable thought: keep calm, things can only get better. And that is going to be a consistent theme of what I'm going to say to you this morning. I'm going to talk, at Simon's invitation, I'm going to talk for 45 minutes perhaps, and then we've got lots of time for Q&A, and we can take it wherever you'd like to take it. So let me first of all introduce myself. You will have seen some details of me on the website and on the invitation. Who am I? I'm the business editor of The Spectator. The Spectator is the oldest continuously published newspaper in the English language. That's a proud claim. We have appeared every Saturday since July of 1828. The Times newspaper of London is older, but it had a year-long strike in 1979. Some of you might remember, so it is not the continuously published oldest newspaper in the English language. We are. I have been writing for The Spectator for about 30 years and for many other publications, notably the Daily Telegraph. Before that, I was an investment banker, or what used to be called a merchant banker long ago, for 15 years. And I worked in the Far East, I worked in Eastern Europe, and I worked in the City of London. So I came from a financial background and moved into journalism, and I've written all sorts of stuff over the years, but always with a kind of sympathetic eye to business, because I started in business. I believe I have more than most journalists an understanding of how business people think. And I would say that's been particularly fostered, encouraged by my role the last 3 years, coordinating, being pretty well in charge of The Spectator's Economic Innovator of the Year awards for high growth entrepreneur-led businesses. I realize that's what a lot of the client base of HURST are. So it's a great pleasure for me to connect with you today. These awards are probably involving companies that are at a bit earlier stage than many of you. They are young startup companies in their first 5 or 10 years of life, first 1 to 5 million of revenues, perhaps not yet in profit. We had over 3 years some 400 entries from all over the UK. Last year, despite pandemic onset in the first quarter, we had 150 entries. I had the great pleasure of speaking to all the shortlisted ones, about 24 of them, all sorts of sectors, all sorts of terrific, innovative ideas. And one common theme, which again, I'm going to talk a bit about this morning, which was resilience, optimism, a willingness and eagerness to look beyond the pandemic, a willingness to pivot both product and working arrangements, switching almost immediately from office working to working at home, changing the product line and so on, making a social contribution where they could and so on. So I found that the most uplifting thing I did last year, to be perfectly honest. It really, really encouraged me, kept me cheerful in all my writing about business. And it showed me what makes a good entrepreneur, a good business leader. And I know that you will largely agree with me that it has a great deal to do with the passion and dedication, the urge to perfect the product, to find the customers and so on, to do the business itself from which the profit flows. And we nowadays talk a lot about purpose in business. Well, the purpose of entrepreneurship was, in almost every case that I talked to, it was about the perfectionism, perfecting the product, far more than it was about financial engineering or about looking for the ultimate exit, though those two can be very important things, I appreciate. The other thing I'm doing currently is researching and writing a book titled The Good, the Bad and the Greedy, Why We've Lost Faith with Capitalism. We means the broader public, particularly the British public. There is a great deal of cynicism, suspicion of big shareholder capitalism, not so much of entrepreneurship. But in this country, there is a cultural divide. There is a certain, at some levels, it's a snobbery. At other levels, it's just a suspicion. It's reflected in all sorts of mass cultural things, including television soap operas. The business people tend to be spivs and baddies and you know, not great contributors to their communities and so on. So that's something I'm examining in an academic sense. I'm at St. Antony's College, Oxford, when I'm allowed to be there, and thinking broadly about capitalism. And you'll hear some strands of that as I go on. So if we could have the next slide. This is merely to remind you how very, very different things are this year from last year and the year before. That is, in fact, a photograph of me on the right. I think it's on the right as you're looking at it. I have another life in the performing arts as a playwright, performance poet, amateur actor and director, and pantomime dame. So there I am those are the three little piggies. There I am in costume. Of course, I haven't been able to do pantomime this last season. We haven't been able to do so much. So many of us, the entire performing arts sector is closed down and doesn't know when it's going to reopen. Though, you know, that cheerful period of 2018, 2019, so much has gone, so much has changed in our priorities, in our way of thinking. We could go to the next slide. What would we have been talking about if we'd met a year ago? Well, I mean, in terms of issues, some of these, Brexit and Boris, are two things we're going to talk about today. We would have been talking about then, both things which are, you know, largely unsatisfactory, I suggest, for entrepreneurs. Still a headache, Brexit and Boris, and I'm coming back to those. Lockdown, we never imagined in our wildest dreams we would be in 3 successive extended lockdowns, emptying our high streets, creating an economic situation, you know, one in a century perhaps anyway, certainly not in anyone's lifetime like this. We'd have been talking last year much more about climate change issues as a problem that the business sector has to address, has to adjust to, but also can find opportunities in. We'd have been talking about Donald Trump. Well, thank God he's gone, really. We might have been saying, some people might have been saying, well, actually, Trump is a friend of Boris. He's a friend of Britain. He's kind of likes the Anglo-Saxon world much more than he doesn't like Europe, for instance, and so on. But actually, what we can say in farewell to Trump is that he was an utterly maverick, unsuitable, frankly, stupid occupant of the White House. His interests were wholly egotistical, translated into America first in the crudest possible way. So he was never going to be a terrific economic ally. And I'll come back to Biden a bit later, but thank God Trump has left the stage. We would have been talking about China as a coming economic force, as a threat, as a bad actor in human rights in Hong Kong and so on, as a difficult counterparty to deal with. Not, you know, there was a time when George Osborne as Chancellor wanted to be seen as the best friend of China. Well, no British government minister now would want to be the best friend of China or make those sort of noises, but we still want Chinese investment in our, in nuclear power, in other things. I come back to infrastructure investment. So China would have been an issue. Now, the agenda's changed. As I say, we're still on Boris and Brexit, but we're still now in our third lockdown. So we're looking at the effect of lockdown, the vaccine rollout, the changeover to Biden, and some other things. You may be wondering, what's that funny green blob in one picture on that screen? Well, that's actually Stonehenge. I'm going to talk about infrastructure investment, one example of which is the possibility of a tunnel under Stonehenge on the A303, a classic Keynesian stimulus project. So let's come to that in a little while. Anyway, next slide, please. The vaccine rollout. This is absolutely top of the news agenda at the moment. It is the light at the end of the tunnel. It is advancing at a really pretty remarkable pace. So we're at nearly 5 million first recipients of a dose. My own 92-and-a-half-year-old mother has had 2 shots of the Pfizer vaccine in quick succession and would be doing the conga round Helmsley, North Yorkshire, if she could find anyone else who was willing to socialize with her. But you can begin to see already in the older segment of the active older people a change of mood. So I wrote a column in the Spectator back in November, where I think I was one of the first journalists to get on to just how tricky this would be, how many political issues this would give rise to, how the media would be constantly pushing ahead of government saying, why isn't this happening? What's the, the postcode lottery? Why aren't some of the ethnic communities who appear to be more susceptible, why aren't they getting it first? If they're reluctant to have the vaccine, how is the government addressing that? And when I wrote that column, what I unearthed in the reactions I had, including from the head of the vaccine task force herself, because I said, we've got this thing called the vaccine task force. Is its task to roll out the vaccine? Well, it turned out it wasn't in charge of it. And Kate Bingham, the lady in charge of it, was very stung and very keen to point out she wasn't in charge. Well, who was? The answer at that point was 2 committees somewhere buried in Whitehall in the NHS. Well, was that going to work? No. So belatedly, a minister called Nadhim Zahawi, who seems to be one of the more competent, detail-driven ministers, as appeared up front, is in charge. It does seem to be rolling out very fast. Sir Richard Sykes, the ex-Glaxo chief, who I think has been asked to keep an oversight of this, was saying this morning he doesn't think there's a fundamental supply problem. He does think there's a logistics problem because it's huge. It's never been done on that scale. Anyway, it's going very fast. That's good. That will make a difference by when? By Easter, possibly. Frankly, I don't know what you think. I don't think it'll make that much difference until the summer. I think travel, anything travel related, anything crowd event related, anything that brings large numbers of people together in close proximity is going to remain restricted for much longer than that. And that has all sorts of effects on the economy and on you as entrepreneurs in some sectors. Is the government really capable? Well, so far so good. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They proved incapable of a sensible rollout of test and trace. We've almost forgotten that exists. The PPE provision turned into a fiasco and a scandal, but still they eventually got enough PPE out there. Anyway, as I say, benefit of the doubt, it's going well so far. It will make a difference, but let's face it, it's going to take a long time. Next slide, please. So the general economic background. So I'm not a technical economist. I don't throw out lots of data in talks like this. You all know just as well as I do what the economy feels like right now. It is clearly heading into, it is in the second part of a double dip recession. The Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey and the Chancellor have both used words like it's going to get worse before it gets better. But what's evident both from what happened in the third quarter of last year, when we were released from lockdown, and what we can see in other countries that are ahead of us in terms of controlling the virus, is that the recovery can be remarkably fast, just as we'd never seen a dip in GDP, stay on that one, thank you, as dramatic as we saw in the second quarter last year, and we've been seeing just very recently. So overall, we might be down 12% when they've added everything up for 2020. The recovery in the third quarter was going very fast, and it will go very fast again. So we may make back 5% in 2021. We may be back to where we started from by some time towards the end of 2022. So in that sense, we can look forward to a fast recovery. Many businesses I've spoken to, and I'm sure that HURST is speaking to, are talking about, quite exciting prospects in the second half of this year. There will, however, be a lingering, much higher level of unemployment for some time, but that's offset by a factor which, frankly, is in many ways a very worrying factor, but it's going to change the numbers, which is that over 1 million people, foreign workers in the UK, have left. A very large number of European EU citizens have left this country, returned to their home countries. Well, that means they've taken a lot of skills and a lot of willingness to work in lower paid segments of the economy. They've taken that with them. We don't know quite how that's going to play out. But anyway, unemployment is going to be a factor. Interest rates, I've not read anything that says interest rates are going to start rising quickly, even though the continuing rise of public sector debt, which you can see in that graph, is one force that might play towards interest rates rising. But the fact is there are deflationary factors in this economy. Inflation appears to be staying low. You might think there would be inflation from all the quantitative easing that's taken place, which boosts asset prices and so on, but it hasn't really happened. We're in such unusual territory, unknown territory in terms of the rapid rise of public borrowing, that we don't honestly know how that's going to play out, whether the government is simply going to let it run at an exceptionally high level for quite a long period of time, eroded slightly over time by inflation and by growth of the economy generally. The government is clearly not going to start paying back that peak of debt very fast. But so we want a prediction for the next couple of years. It's that interest rates will stay low. Inflation probably won't become a problem. It might sneak up to 3% briefly, but on the whole, inflation seems dormant. So that's the economic background. Let's move on again. So this question is, Boris's government pro-business, and does it matter? Well, the simple answer is, it isn't. I mean, Boris himself is not interested in business. I was appointed by Boris. I knew Boris very well. I worked alongside him both at the Telegraph, Daily Telegraph, where I used to be a leader writer, and subsequently he was my editor at the Spectator, and he appointed me as business editor. So I know very closely how interested Boris is in business, and the answer is not at all, really. Why did he appoint me as business editor? Well, I believe it's because the late Sir David Barclay, the proprietor, who died just a few days ago, you may have seen his obituary, he and his twin brother and their sons became the owners of the Spectator alongside the Telegraph, late 2004, I think. And they had Andrew Neil, a very feisty journalist, as their sort of man of business in the media sector. He became chairman of the Spectator. And I think he said to Boris, "Oh, come on, Boris, you haven't even got a business editor." And Boris said, "Oh, yes, I have. It's Martin Vander Weyer." And then rang me and said, "Martin, if anybody asks, you're my business editor." And I've held that title ever since. But it was always difficult to persuade him to include business content in the magazine. And he's not interested in numbers. He's not interested in economic ideas. He didn't appoint very strong business ministers. First of all, Andrea Leadsom, then Alok Sharma, you see in the picture there. Now, a slightly more potent figure, I think, Kwasi Kwarteng has just taken over that job. I have slightly higher hopes for him. Boris, tried to get out of speaking to the CBI in November, and then at the last minute changed his mind, reappeared, at a different time, a sort of shambolic effort. But honestly, he's not interested in business. Does it matter? Well, luckily, in his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, Rishi is the new sort of hero, the best we've got for the business sector. He's, of course, a hero partly because he's been giving away money like crazy in all directions. The furlough scheme, business grants, you can get them. We could, even the little business that I'm involved in, which is an arts center in my small town, repeatedly we've had injections of cash from various of Rishi's schemes. Let's have the next slide, please. But that's the one, thank you. Rishi, I do have high hopes for. I do know him personally slightly. He's a neighboring MP in North Yorkshire. He was very willing to meet me in a pub for lunch when he was a junior minister in the Communities and Local Government Department, and he was pushing an idea about free ports. That was one of his schemes. But I thought he was a most engaging, intelligent, switched on guy who really knew a lot about business. He worked for Goldman Sachs. That's a big that's a big badge to wear, but he's been in the private equity world. And so high hopes for him. In his spending review in November, the last we heard from him, he was doing emergency measures, really. There were some infrastructure promises. There was a cap on public sector pay, which was controversial. There was a lot more money for the NHS. There was a cut in overseas aid, but we didn't really see where he was going to go next. And certainly we didn't see how he's ever going to recoup all that cash that he has put out, whilst continuing to stimulate as much of the economy as he can. Well, we may see in March in his budget which way all that's going to go. Some questions very relevant to the entrepreneur community. What will he do to capital gains tax? There is a body of opinion that says that's an obvious tax that can be harmonized with income taxes. It's in some ways it's too generous to those who have capital gains. It's especially generous to the private equity sector, who are able to take the carry, as it were, on advantageous terms. So they may take a hit. He may look at pension reliefs at the higher end and on the triple lock that keeps state pensions going up and up and up. The stamp duty holiday, raising the stamp duty threshold from 125,000 to 500,000, had an amazing impact on the housing market, partly because the psychology of lockdown. There were hundreds of thousands of people looking at Rightmove every day. I was one of them, thinking, God, I wish I could move house. And suddenly there's a up to £15,000 sort of incentive in that stamp duty cut. So the housing market has been running hot since July. House prices have gone up as a consequence of that. Estate agents are very happy. The turnover is terrific. Will he continue that? Will he abolish stamp duty and do something else? Put on a property tax that could be a bit like a wealth tax? Personally, I hope not. I think what he might do is notch down the stamp duty threshold in stages again, keep the housing market running. A bigger question coming up is, when and how will we move to a position of more tax competitiveness in terms of corporation tax rates and incentives for inward investment and so on post-Brexit, whilst running the risk that by diverging from European tax and relief and state aid rules, that we risk, more border chaos, more difficulties with the EU trying to shut us out of Europe. So those are topics that will come up in March and come up repeatedly as time goes on. Then there's something called levelling up, which again, very relevant to Manchester and the Northwest. It's an important peg of this government's manifesto from before the pandemic. It will certainly come up again in the recovery. Let's have the next slide. Levelling up, what does it mean? Well, a whole chunk of Northern England voted Conservative in the last election, previously long held by Labour working class seats, and they are expecting something in return from this government for that. The red wall is the jargon for those seats, and they feel they're on a promise. What will they get? The picture, incidentally, there is a picture of Ashington in Northumberland, former mining town, a classic example of what came to be known as left behind community in the north of England. The mines closed that employed 5,000 miners. What came instead? There is one robotic, I think it's a pharmaceutical factory. I can't remember. There's one new factory. It employs 200 highly skilled people and 1,000 robots. It doesn't employ 5,000 people. Ashington has very poor road and rail connections. Its broadband isn't very good. Its housing isn't very good. Its civic life, its community life is diminished. Andy Haldane, brilliant chief economist of the Bank of England, wrote a whole paper with Ashington in the title of it, which I commend to you, analyzing how these communities have suffered, how they might be rebuilt, what they need. So what does that mean in terms of opportunity for business and entrepreneurs? Well, there will be road and rail projects. There will be an attempt to improve broadband so that people can work from home in such places more easily. Though I'm going to talk a bit about the green industrial revolution in a moment, but where that goes, there will be incentives to put your, have your industrial unit with a sort of, innovative green business in these areas. There will be more social housing being built. There should be much more skills education. There may be a shift of public sector jobs, of government departments from London to the north. Even there was talk of putting the House of Lords in York, you might remember. I don't think that's really going to happen. But that's what levelling up means. It would be a good thing in every social sense, but it also creates quite a lot of opportunities for entrepreneur-led businesses. So let's go to the next slide, please. We're still in a period of, frankly, I've called it in this week's column, unraveling chaos in the post-Brexit period, which is somewhat after that first, the lorry crisis that was to do with the new variant of COVID rather than Brexit that happened in mid-December. That picture on the right is Manston Airfield with all the lorries parked there in Kent because they couldn't cross the channel till the drivers had positive COVID tests. But it gave a foretaste of how it might be, and I think that stimulated the negotiating teams to come to some agreement on at least trade in physical goods before the December deadline. They were always most likely to get there. It was really unlikely they'd come to no deal. But the fact is, the deal they've come to, we're now seeing, creates new sets of border controls, bureaucracy, and paperwork, uncertainty for many sectors. And we've seen it first in Scottish seafood suppliers. I mean, container loads of scallops and langoustines and other delicacies that were on a next day delivery system for many years were reaching the restaurants and the gourmet tables of France and Belgium and even as far as Spain the next day. The whole system just broke down, and this stuff is completely perishable, and if it couldn't be delivered the next day, the customers didn't want to buy it. And that's a tragedy for the Scottish fishermen, many of whom were very strongly pro-Brexit as it happens. But we now read wine importers don't know how to proceed. most important in terms of physical goods really is our automotive industry, the just-in-time parts supply system that keeps our automotive factories supplied at just hours' notice. Is that going well? Apparently not. The Sunday Times was saying some auto factories are really struggling. Good news today is that Nissan, whose Sunderland plant, Washington plant, just some 40 or 50 miles north of where I'm speaking, that Nissan has reaffirmed its commitment to that plant for electric vehicles. And so there is longer term, it could be okay. But again, on this slide, you see a picture of Jim Ratcliffe, the Ineos billionaire tycoon who decided to build a factory to recreate the Land Rover Defender. He was going to put it in South Wales. He's now decided to put it in Alsace, where I think he was offered a former Peugeot factory on cheap terms. There was a workforce right there that had worked in that factory. Alsace is bang in the middle of all the supply lines in the center of the EU. Why not go there? Why risk being in South Wales and not being able to get your parts in on time? So you can see where that trend might go. The picture in the middle is the financial district of Frankfurt, with lots of new buildings being built. Actually, shift of jobs in the financial sector is thought to be maybe 7,500 jobs so far. Isn't very much, but we have so far no clear final agreement about access for financial services to the UK and other service businesses, slightly clearer for some professional services like the legal sector, I believe, but there's still a lot of negotiation to go. It was never the intention that financial services were going to be dealt with in detail in the December trade cooperation agreement. A memorandum of understanding on that is due by the 31st of March. But again, as I've written lately in my column, the city has been rather left to fight its own corner, and the British negotiators so far, and the city, the Bank of England and the Chancellor and the BEIS have not shown any indication of being particularly tough. I mean, we're still offering plenty of access to the UK financial market and the City of London for European banks and financial service providers. They are beginning to indicate how tough they could be in terms of permitting equivalence to our financial services business in their member states. So there's a lot to play for there. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about President Biden. I'm sure if you watched it as I did, you found the inauguration ceremony on Wednesday an uplifting moment. Not just Biden himself, I thought, made a fine speech. That delightful young Black poet, Amanda Gorman, you know, her lines about even as we hurt, we hoped, even as we tired, we tried. I thought that was just tremendous. One thing I would say, any of you who are entrepreneurs in the business of mounting big public events or ceremonial, I'm sure there's an export opportunity there, because the Americans are just terrible at it. I mean, Lady Gaga singing the national anthem followed by Jennifer Lopez, I thought, God, this is a new low in public ceremonial. Even so, I think they overcame their slight weakness in terms of ceremonial presentation compared to us. We do it so brilliantly in this country. It was very uplifting. And what can you say about Biden? He's a Democrat. Democrats are typically, very concerned with job protection, more inclined to protectionism perhaps than traditional Republicans, and higher tax and so on. That's typical Democrat politics, but things are different now. So Biden is a return to business as usual in US government in a very broad sense, and is appointing rapidly very experienced, proper government people to all his key posts, which Trump did not do. Trump either appointed mavericks like himself or left jobs vacant, so that large parts of the federal government were frankly dysfunctional throughout his tenure. Biden is already introducing various measures of stimulus for the US economy and rapid COVID action, including vaccine rollout, which will help a rapid recovery of the US economy, and that will wash over. There's always some impact from the US economy on our economy and on European economies, perhaps less so than a generation or two ago, but it will help. And it will help markets too, stock markets. He is ready. There's some talk, well, he'll go and do a trade deal with Europe first, and he'll leave us at the back of the queue, where Obama once said the UK was going to be. I don't think that's true. I think he will deal with the EU and the UK in parallel, and those talks will proceed at the pace of trade talks, which isn't always fast, but there's no reason why the UK should be left behind. Except that, the last point on the slide, Boris Johnson himself has some personal ground to make up. He is, people like to paint him as having been a friend of Trump at a certain stage. He's backed away from that. He was quite rude about Biden, I think, at an earlier point, but then he's been rude about lots of people. And he has, one of Boris's qualities, assets, is he has a certain personal charm, a certain forgivable quality, a certain way of laughing and shrugging his shoulders and so on, that makes people like him. You saw that in European negotiations. I'm sure, he's a man Biden can get on terms with rapidly. They're going to meet at a summit in Cornwall quite soon. I think that will be overcome. Biden will be in favor of climate action. That may be restrictive on businesses in a way that Trump rolled back regulation to let it rip. Coal mining and stuff in the US, was given a free hand under Trump. It will be restrained. But climate action, as we'll see also in a moment, creates opportunities for entrepreneurs in the whole green industrial revolution. Biden is ready to talk about regulating big tech. Whether he's ready to talk about digital taxes, the sort of thing that European and the UK government have talked about but not done much about, that is specific new taxes on big digital multinationals that are profiting from their power here and everywhere when their local and less digital competitors are suffering. Whether he'll go that far isn't clear, but regulating them in more strongly than ever before is a possibility too. So as you can see in that list, again, there are things that will hold back certain sectors of business somewhat, but there are many other things that will create opportunities. Next slide, please. So beyond Brexit, beyond the pandemic, what are we talking about? Green industrial revolution. It's a slogan so far, but it will be a real thing for the next decade. That means electric vehicles, especially. That electric vehicles, of course, requires not just terrific entrepreneurship, progress on the, batteries, creating lighter batteries with more storage capacity. A lot of interesting UK companies working in that sector, but it also requires the government to incentivize and drive forward the network of plug-in places for electric vehicles, which is way behind where we need it to be now. And that does need government impetus. Wind power, offshore wind power, there used to be a lot of skepticism. Now I think we realize we can be a leader in the percentage of offshore wind power. Tidal power may come into play and so on. Again, lots of entrepreneurs working in those areas. The construction industry, the house building industry is decades, even half a century behind in many cases in the way they build houses. These are not largely sort of eco houses, but they could be. Insulation, home heating systems, all of that, enormous opportunities. So I think we will see all of that move forward. In infrastructure, there's a set of projects that are either behindhand or threatening to be, that will now need to move forward. The Crossrail scheme in London a fantastic scheme when it opens. It should have opened nearly 2 years ago. It didn't. It's stuck on some issue about software on the trains, about connecting the signaling systems as the train comes out of the new tunnel onto the existing network rail networks. They just can't get the software to connect. They overspent. They stopped the station developments. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. But that will eventually start and will make a difference. HS2, you may say we need it. You may say we don't need it. Where you are in the northwest, you may say stronger, more frequent, well, rather more frequent and completely regular to timetable train services would be fine if they have a good broadband connection on the train and we can work on the train. Don't waste money on HS2. We could debate that all day. Hinkley Point, picture there, power station in Somerset is advancing, I believe is on budget, being built by EDF of France, has some Chinese investment in it. That's a controversial thing. I think that will come on stream and provide 7% of our power needs, but we're still unclear whether the next one, Sizewell in Suffolk, will be built. The one beyond that, Bradwell in Essex, is a Chinese project. I think that one definitely won't be built. There's some nuclear power projects in Wales that the Japanese firms, Hitachi was one, were going to build and they've pulled out. So there are big uncertainties about nuclear power. Will renewables provide enough to fill the gap? Another big issue. There's a picture of John Maynard Keynes. Why is he there? Because Keynesian stimulus through infrastructure is well recognized as being a thing that comes round again. Every time we have a depressed economy, people say, let's do infrastructure, let's have a Keynesian stimulus. The Stonehenge tunnel is the absolute ultimate expression of that. They could start digging it now as a Keynesian stimulus, and if the environmentalists protest very, very strongly, they could start filling it in again next time there's a depression, and that'll be another stimulus. So that's kind of how it works. Lastly on there's a picture of Stilton cheese. You're wondering what that is? Well, we hear a lot about new global trade prospects. We've done a deal with Japan in which, remarkably, the International Trade Secretary, Liz Truss, inserted a clause about blue cheese, that we now are able to sell more blue cheese to Japan. Well, I've lived in Japan. I can tell you the absolutely last thing most Japanese people want on their plate, just as we're a bit wary of, fermented bean curd and poisoned blowfish and so on. They really don't like blue cheese. So that's not going anywhere. But, well, we'll see where the new trade opportunities arise. What do we have to export? We have higher and private education is a very important export area. Professional services like architecture and civil engineering, we're very good at. High-end engineering, we're very good at. Mass, physical production of goods, that's not us. Artisan products, Scotch whiskey, cheese, fine British lamb and beef and so on, maybe. Anyway, we'll see where those trade prospects lead us. Next slide, please. Mixed recovery. Well, I think we've probably covered this. We're not going to see tourism, hospitality, and the cultural sectors come back quickly. The continuing bloodbath in retail and commercial property, I'm sure many of you are very close to that and know what that looks like. We will wait to see how long the government is prepared to keep its furlough schemes going and keep pumping in other injections of funds to keep struggling businesses going. But I think, frankly, they just have to keep the furlough scheme going as long as they keep the lockdowns going. They can't have the one without the other. It would cause just too much hardship. But constant theme of what I'm saying, nevertheless, despite those sectors being badly hit and there being so much uncertainty about when we can come out of this, there are big opportunities. So let's look at those quickly. Next slide, please. As I say, climate change is going to move back to where it was in the business agenda before the pandemic. And there is an opportunity for UK leadership. We are hosting this great conference in Glasgow called COP26. It was deferred to November this year. It will be an enormous, it'll be a hybrid conference. It will be partly a physical presence, partly online, but that will increase the number of people who can participate. And it gives the UK an opportunity to be seen to be absolutely in the lead on this. Boris has talked about being the Saudi Arabia of wind. It's one of those sort of irritating Boris phrases that you think he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't really mean it. But still, we will have a very highly developed offshore and onshore wind power sector. It continues to grow. He has directed quite a lot of state investment in that area. I've talked about electric vehicles. Something else that's going to happen is the development of green finance. That is to say, companies that are fully compliant in terms of their carbon emissions and so on will find easier access to certain kinds of finance, and there will be special financial vehicles and methods of finance for companies that are in this sector, and companies will be kept on their toes by new corporate reporting standards. The former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, is very much in the lead on all the thinking about that. But so the financial sector is going to turn its attention to climate issues and become part of this green finance revolution of the next decade. Next slide, please. No. So in everything I've said, quite obviously, the first challenge is survival. The second thing is, where are the opportunities in recovery? I've talked about green tech, biotech. We've seen remarkable things happening in Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is now the flagship of British science and biotechnology, but many other companies. One of the winners of our Spectator Awards of a couple of years ago, a firm called Touchlight Genetics in Hampton, Middlesex, is a very important manufacturer of DNA material to supply to the laboratories that are developing the vaccines, and has upped its production to supply more DNA to more laboratories. So it's one of the many interesting, innovative, entrepreneurial businesses in that chain. But there's no doubt British biotech and British pharmaceutical research, drug development, has a very high reputation in the world, and it's got higher in this pandemic. Medical entrepreneurial businesses of all kinds have opportunities from this. There's a bigger defense budget. That came as a bit of a surprise, but still, it was a bit of red meat for the Conservative backbenchers, I think. But the defense budget got a boost in November, and defense tech, things like drone aircraft. We have many fine companies working in those areas, artificial intelligence, that kind of thing. Defense tech is going to be big. Urban renewal. I mean, urban wipeout is the current situation. Empty high streets, empty office buildings. I had an extraordinary day in the city of London in November when I was making the video awards ceremony for our Spectator Awards. I was in a building called the Cheese Grater, one of those new towers in the city of London. It has 7,500 desks. It had 100 people at work that day in the building. Looking out, I could see into the Gherkin. I could see into the one that's called the Walkie Talkie in Fenchurch Street. I couldn't see anyone at a desk anywhere in those buildings. Now, it will come back a bit, but there is an enormous amount of office space that may never be used as office space again. What will it become? It could become, residential accommodation. That's the obvious thing. It could become kind of incubator space for small startup businesses. Clever people are going to think of lots of ways of reusing and revivifying, regenerating urban space. Working from home technology. I put on here the pop-up desk made by another of our winners in Northampton called Palite. It was making pallets out of a sort of honeycomb cardboard material. It pivoted to make pop-up desks that cost about £35 for people who are working from home in small bedrooms and so on, and pop-up screens to divide workspaces, things like that. It's doing very, very well. It's an example of, simple example of working from home technology. At the other end of that spectrum is Zoom, fantastic, expansive business. We're on Zoom now. We'd never heard of Zoom a year ago. You know, video conferencing technology, all forms of digital communication to make working from home better. That's going to go strongly. Logistics and fulfillment for all online retailers. A lot of small retailers suddenly became online retailers. They have to pick and pack and post themselves. Again, another winner in our contest called Habu. Create small fulfillment units in empty shops where one guy can run a fulfillment service, picking, packing and posting on behalf of local retailers who've gone online. Brilliant idea. The reverse of building a giant Amazon, you know, warehouse that covers several acres. You do it on a small scale locally. Artisan food and drink producers, everything from, you know, the Stilton cheese to their marvelous entrepreneur. He's called Will Chase in Herefordshire, who's a potato farmer who created Tyrrell's crisps, sold it for lots of money, created a vodka distillery, and has just sold that for lots of money. There's lots of scope for artisan product. People have become more interested in the local, the artisan, the authentic. They want to support entrepreneurs in their community. Estate agent, because the property sector looks as if it'll stay strong for a while. If they take off the stamp duty benefit, it may take a dip. But on the whole, a lot of people have felt the urge to move on, and that will linger for some time. So last slide, please, and then we'll go to Q&A. Is it a good time to expand? Excuse me, that's it. Is it a good time to expand? Well, you tell me. I mean, first of all, skilled staff, software skilled staff, are they going to be readily available? Well, there are a lot of people short of work, but a lot of EU skilled people have left. I'd be very interested to hear how you all see that question. But on the whole, recruitment ought to be easier in a period of, it is traditionally easier to recruit and to staff up new businesses in a recession. But we have lost a lot of skilled people. Workspace clearly is going to be cheap and will be incentivized at the local government level and nationally, I think. Banks will want to be seen to be helpful. You may tell me it's not really the banks that matter, it's the other kind of investors, so long as the banks will give you an overdraft, a payroll provision, that they're helpful with your trade finance arrangements and so on. But banks need to be seen to be lending. They have recapitalized themselves since the financial crisis. The government will be watching very carefully to make sure they are lending actively into the business sector. Private investors, you know, there's no return on your deposit account. At a certain level, private investors, as I know from talking to all these entrepreneurs, are keen to invest, are looking for ideas. Things like crowdfunding sites are pretty busy because people will put money into new businesses. You know, venture capital is still underdeveloped in this country, but it's a growing thing. And venture capitalists will be looking now at all those sectors I just talked about, saying where are the really smart places to put some money next. So I don't think there will be a shortage of private capital at the lower end of the entrepreneur spectrum, as it were, and there will be continuing tax reliefs and grants from government trying to promote these sectors in an intelligent way. So final slide, I think. Reasons to be cheerful. There we are. There I am in my panto costume again. The end of this thing is in sight somewhere. When we have vaccinated all 9 of the vulnerable groups, that's, I think, everyone above 50. I'm in category 5, so I'm waiting to see whether I get vaccinated in the second half of February or the first part of March. There will be a different mood, and the death rate almost certainly should come down dramatically. That will change things. UK science as I said, has had a very good pandemic. Any science-related business ought to benefit from that. Recovery will be fast when it happens. Technological and social progress has been accelerated in dramatic ways. The working from home revolution, the change, the opportunity of urban revival is part of that. And finally, as a general theme, entrepreneurs always hold the key to future prosperity, always take the longer view, have a sense of optimism and resilience on which recovery can be built. So there we are. I'm going to stop there, and I'm sorry I've gone on a little longer than I should have done, but I'm very happy to engage in chat if Simon would like to lob a couple of questions.
Okay, thank you, Martin. As I mentioned, we'll just pause the, stop the recording